This episode was suggested by a listener, Angelia, via our website. If you'd like to make a suggestion, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Hello, listeners. This week, the MCP would like to present an interview on corpse theft in 18th and 19th century England. Our expert is Dr. Jenna Dittmar, Research Associate at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge. Make sure to let us know if you enjoyed this interview, and perhaps we'll set up more. And now, let's talk about corpse theft in 18th and 19th century England. Hello, Dr. Dittmar. Welcome to the Morbid Curiosity Podcast.
Hi, Hallie. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about this ghoulish practice of corpse theft, or the secret removal and subsequent selling of human corpses. I know corpse theft escalated around the same time as the institutionalization of human anatomical studies in medical schools. How are these two practices tied together?
During the 18th century, especially in England, the demand for more widely accessible healthcare created this expansion of medical services, and this resulted in a number of charitable hospitals being founded in cities across the country. So by the end of the 18th century, we've got 4 large voluntary hospitals in London, all of which were teaching anatomy. The increase in these number of hospitals required more doctors, more practitioners to staff them, which is why we see this increase in individuals flocking to London to become doctors. And all of these students were required to dissect 2 bodies each in order to be licensed, which resulted in a large number of cadavers that were required to be dissected. By 1828, there were over 800 medical students attending one of the anatomy schools in London. They were dissecting between 450 and 500 bodies a year collectively. Only 8 cadavers were actually legally available at this time. So in 1752, the Murder Act, if you'd like its full title, an act for better preventing the horrid crime of murder, gave the anatomist the right to dissect the bodies of murderers publicly. The new role of the corpse brought a change in the scientific perception of the body, but this directly conflicted with religious and social beliefs within the populace. There was a lot of concern that the fragmentation of the body that resulted from human dissection would prevent an individual's resurrection on Judgment Day, and thus prevent eternal life and the loss of their identity forever. The Murder Act was intended to be an eternal punishment in the form of dissection that was reserved specifically for the heinous crime of murder. However, even with the passing of the Murder Act, the bodies of the felons hardly made a dent in the ever-growing demand for bodies to dissect during the late 17 and 1800s. So between 1805 and 1820, it's been estimated that 1,150 people were executed in Britain. That's an average of about 77 a year. However, we know from the historical records of the time that the medical schools required about 500 bodies a year. That's a difference of 423 bodies, which had to come from somewhere. The disparity between the number of legally available cadavers and the number that were required for anatomical education evoked the rise of the infamous resurrectionists, or gangs of grave robbers. So these men would go and dig up the freshly buried bodies from graveyards, or they would break into houses and steal the deceased from coffins before burial. And bodies obtained through these illicit means became the main source of dissection subjects before the passing of the Anatomy Act in 1832.
Wow, that really is ghoulish.
Yes, it is.
So they would break into people's houses?
Yes, they would. So bodies would be laid out in the parlor for viewing, and the bodies would be taken from there. More commonly, though, bodies would be taken from something called dead houses that were associated with hospitals. So generally, these voluntary hospitals were for poor members of society, almost exclusively men, because women were generally not allowed to enter these institutions, and they would be awaiting burial or be waiting to be claimed by their family. And if they wouldn't be collected, then they would be sometimes taken or sold by the proprietor.
What were these stolen corpses used for? What did anatomists do with them?
Most of the bodies went for dissection, but also some went for medical research, and then some bodies, after they were dissected, would have been put in medical museums. So these bodies would be prepared and laid out for them in the back room, normally called some kind of a dissecting room. Because bodies were so scarce, they often dissected these in pieces through a practice called cadaver sharing. They would divide the body up into usually 5 to 8 segments and separate the parts out to give everyone an equal opportunity to be dissecting, even though it wasn't a full body. So you would have a leg one day, and then perhaps you would move on to a hand or something like that.
Were they still doing public dissections at that time?
Yeah, they still were, but not as much. A lot more dissection took place behind closed doors during the late 1700s, 1800s than previously. They would do your ceremonial cuts for the public, and then that body would then be taken into the back room, into the dissecting room, and then fully dissected after that.
What are the ceremonial first cuts?
Generally, they would open the thoracic and abdominal cavities. It was more of a display to deter individuals from committing murder because the fear of dissection was so great. This was considered a last and final insult to the corpse, which you deserved because you were a murderer.
You said that some of the bodies ended up in medical museums. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Sure. In addition to being dissected, sometimes body parts would be collected and preserved so they could be put on display in a medical museum. These collected organs are called anatomical preparations or preparations, and they were primarily used as teaching tools, either to demonstrate the normal anatomy or sometimes to show the extent of a pathological process. So medical museums were essential to the study of anatomy, especially from the mid-1700s to about the end of the 19th century. But we do know that anatomical preparations were used for a long time before that. I think the oldest known anatomical preparation dates to about 1200 to 1280 AD, and it's actually the dried head and neck of an adult man that you can see has clearly been dissected.
Wow, I would not have expected it to be that old.
It is interesting, though, that we don't really see other evidence of anatomical dissection that early, but we know it was happening, and the way that it was performed was actually very similar. So this preparation has a craniotomy where they cut off the top part of the skull so they could examine the brain, and it's done in an almost identical fashion to the ones that we're seeing from 1910. So the procedure hasn't really changed that much in all of that time. So these museum collections, many of which you can still visit today, often contained not only the saved organs from those individuals that were dissected, sometimes they also contained the waste from surgical procedures. Sometimes we see projectiles from firearms that have been surgically removed, or kidney or bladder stones, in addition to amputated limbs. But what was really prized and sought after by anatomists were those bodies that had rare congenital defects, such as the bodies of conjoined twins, or of an individual that had a condition like dwarfism or gigantism. These bodies were a source of particular fascination in Victorian Britain, and still today. We know that some anatomists went to extraordinary lengths to get these bodies, specifically so they could have them in their own personal collections. John Hunter, for example, who was a very well-known anatomist and avid collector, was known to have paid huge sums of money for bodies that he wanted to display in his museum, even if it was against the will of the individual. And we know this was the case with Charles Byrne, who was also known as the Irish Giant.
The Irish Giant is the guy that told his friends to hide his body, and then John Hunter found his friends and paid them, correct?
That's exactly right. He told his friends that under no circumstances he wanted to be put in a medical museum because he was aware that John Hunter wanted his body. So he asked his friends to bury him at sea, but John Hunter actually paid his friends off and took the body. It is still on display in the Royal College of Surgeons in London.
With friends like these, eh?
Right? I know, it's This was obviously really ethically dubious. So from this example, we can see that the bodies of the famous, or even the infamous, were highly desirable for these medical museums. There's actually an example of a body that was stolen, we believe, specifically so that it could be put in a medical museum after it was dissected here at Cambridge. The body of the Yorkshire author Lawrence Sterne was removed from his grave in London and transported to the University of Cambridge at the bidding of one of the anatomical professors here. They dissected his body in a way that was very non-invasive in order specifically to save it so that it could be put on display in the anatomical collection here.
What do you mean by non-invasive?
They didn't saw open his skull, for example. His skull was completely intact. So it was very atypical for a dissection of the time, especially when you don't have very many bodies that you're able to dissect. We don't actually have the body any longer. We only have the skull, but there's no evidence on the skull that it had been dissected at all. We see some brush marks and some knife marks, but that's it, basically.
So they were trying to preserve his features so that they would know it was him?
I think so, yeah. We do see that occasionally with infants as well, where they won't open the skull because they want to save the skulls for a different purpose. Usually, in the case of children anyway, they want to look at the series of development. But with an adult, it's likely not sawn open for a different reason. The bodies of children were dissected in a very similar way to the bodies of adults after a certain age. After about 3 years of age, a body was treated very similarly. But before that, we do see some differences in how fetal and infant bodies were treated by anatomists. Part of this could be a difference in size. Obviously, the body of an infant is much smaller than the body of an adult. But I think the reasons that they are dissected differently does have a lot to do with how society views individuals in these different categories. And as a result, they had a very different role to play in anatomical education. However, there doesn't really seem to be very many fetal and infant bodies kept in these anatomical collections.
Do you think maybe they were getting rid of those bodies after they dissected them because children had this place in society that was a little bit more protected? Do you think maybe they found a way to cremate them or get rid of the body so that the evidence wouldn't be there?
That is certainly a possibility. But I think part of it might be that they're hiding in plain sight. They might still be housed in these medical collections or put in a back room someplace and saved rather than trying to intentionally be destroyed. Because we do have to remember that the anatomists, none of what they were doing was illegal. Well, technically. Certainly not ethical, but none of what they were doing was actually illegal. They were allowed to dissect these bodies, and certainly after 1832, they could legally dissect any of these unclaimed bodies, so that would include the bodies of children as well as adults. I do actually think they were probably more likely kept in these anatomical collections, many of which now have drastically reduced in size or have largely disintegrated. But some of these collections do still exist, and I think more research into what was kept by these anatomical collections will really help us further understand who was involved and who was being dissected as part of this early anatomical movement in London.
That's interesting.
Yes, it is.
Resurrectionists were paid by anatomists, right?
Yes, absolutely. Here's an interesting fact. The first resurrectionists were actually the medical students or the anatomists themselves. However, most were fearful of punishment or persecution, or certainly damaging their reputation, so they would offer to pay money for these corpses rather than try to obtain them themselves. So during the early 18th century, grave robbing became quite profitable, enough to attract quite a few individuals outside of the medical community to start participating in this trade. Most schools would actually work with a single group of resurrectionists. The resurrectionists would be hired to provide them with cadavers through the course of the academic year. At the beginning of each year, the anatomist would be visited by the resurrection men, who would offer to supply them regularly with corpses based on a fixed price. Once this was paid, bodies would be delivered directly to that anatomy school. but it does seem that there was quite a lot of variation in what different medical schools would pay. We have some reports that bodies were worth 2 guineas each, but other reports that suggest that up to 16 guineas was paid for a body.
So there were some differences in pricing. Were any of the corpses more valued by anatomists for the information they possessed rather than monetarily?
We have quite a bit of research that suggests that pregnant women specifically were highly prized commodities. Also, fetal cadavers or infants were quite prized by anatomists because of the information they were able to extract about development. And we know this because of how these bodies were treated by the anatomists. Female bodies were much less common. But I do think that has everything to do with the socio-political identity of women rather than the fact that they were more or less valued by anatomists. It is looking more like women were not as prevalent in the institutions from which bodies would be collected after 1832. And this all has everything to do with the passing of the New Poor Laws in 1834, which officially ended outdoor relief for the able-bodied individuals, meaning that people that were destitute could only receive aid if they were living inside of a workhouse, and only men were able to be admitted to the majority of hospitals. So between these two institutions, we had much fewer women present, so there would be less women that would be dissected. There's a quote, actually, in one of the anatomical textbooks from 1740s stating that if you have an opportunity of dissecting a female subject, even if it's in the summer, you must not refuse, because this opportunity doesn't come around as often as the opportunity to dissect a male. This, to me, does suggest that female subjects were more scarce and thus maybe slightly more valued because of their scarcity.
When it says even in the summer, I'm guessing that refers to the rate of decay, and it would be much worse in the summer?
Yes, that's right. Bodies were typically dissected during the winter months just because rate of decomposition would be slightly slower. The rate of decomposition of a body actually influenced the way that these bodies were dissected. They would start with the thoracic cavity, which contains the stomach and the intestines, which putrefy much quicker than muscle tissue. So they would generally start by examining the organs in the abdominal and thoracic cavities and then work their way to the extremities. And also, no, I don't want to say that. I was going to talk about the smell, but I don't want to talk about it.
Oh, go for it.
The dissecting room was not a particularly pleasant place. You have to remember that these bodies wouldn't have been preserved other than sometimes would be wrapped in alcohol-soaked linen strips to try to delay putrefaction. But a lot of medical men would take up smoking pipes in order to try to mask the stench of the dissecting room. And by all accounts, the dissecting room was a really unpleasant place to work.
I can only imagine.
They also used to wear like suits and top hats and everything in the dissecting room. The photographs are fantastic. It's a far cry from the dissection room these days, that's for certain. Coats and your goggles and your gloves and
all the health and safety that we now have compared to top hats and suits.
Yeah, and pipes. Just, smoking your pipe over the top of a dead body. That also doesn't fly these days.
Did they wear any sort of protective gear for this at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've seen some images depicting these medical men wearing aprons, but there were no gloves or anything. Actually, there was quite a lot of concern about accidentally cutting yourself if you were in the process of dissection and getting blood sepsis as a result. So the dissection room was actually also quite a dangerous place for these medical men. But no, there were no gloves, there were no glasses. It was a different time.
How did these resurrectionists or resurrection men get the corpses? Was there a standard method that they all used?
We actually have very little written evidence for the actions of the resurrectionists, for obvious reasons. Grave robbing was only a felony if the clothing or the objects were removed from the grave, because a body could not be stolen because you can't own a body. Even though stealing the body itself wasn't a crime, if the body still had clothing or personal possessions, they could be charged and put in jail.
That's so surprising that it wasn't illegal to steal the body, but it was illegal to steal their things.
Yes, absolutely. How they went about getting the bodies out of the grave. We only have one first-hand account detailing resurrectionist activity, and this is called the Diary of the Resurrectionist, and it was believed to have been written by Joseph Naples, who was a resurrectionist. And he stated that his gang could acquire over 300 corpses a year of men, women, and of children. Generally, these gangs of resurrectionists would come at night and dig up the freshly buried bodies. We know very little about this because we only have the single first-hand account of resurrectionist activity, specifically in London. But we do have a number of drawings and cartoons, contemporary cartoons, that depict the taking of bodies out of the ground by digging a hole at one end and pulling the body out of the hole after they stripped the corpse of his clothing and personal possessions to avoid a charge of theft. In the Diary of the Resurrectionist, we clearly see that the members of the gang were recording bodies as either larges or smalls referring to the bodies of children specifically. And the prices that the resurrectionists could charge were slightly different based on if the body was that of an adult or that of a child. The bodies of children were generally sold by the inch, so the price would depend on how large the body was. The diary tells us that in 1809 to 1810, 360 adult bodies were stolen from various graveyards around London, plus with a note here saying they had 44 smalls, or the bodies of children. This was a trend that was fairly consistent throughout the time that the diary was being kept. It says here in 1810 to 1811, we had 332 adult bodies and 47 smalls. However, smalls referred specifically to the bodies of children rather than the bodies of infants or fetuses, which were listed completely separately in the Diary of the Resurrectionist. However, we do think that they were probably still paid for by the inch.
And where were they getting these? Were they just taking them out of the cemeteries and dead houses, as you mentioned before?
Basically, yes. The majority of these were coming from the same paupers' fields that the adult bodies came from. There was some talk about they got some from hospitals, but a lot of the places listed in the Diary of the Resurrectionist are code names, so it's not always 100% clear where these bodies were actually coming from. Some of these are probably cemeteries that nobody's heard of in 150 years, so we know where some of them are, but we don't know where all of them are. So these bodies would then be taken to hospitals and put up for sale, or for dissection or medical research. Occasionally, they wouldn't be purchased at all. It doesn't actually say what happened to these bodies. There's a note here, actually, in the diary saying that they had 37 bodies from Edinburgh that the gang had collected but were never used. What used means, I assume, is that they were not sold or moved on, but what did they do with them? It's really unclear.
That's actually quite disturbing.
Yes, it is. The fact that we don't know what happened to a good number of these individuals is incredibly disturbing. Bodies would be taken out of the graves, usually at paupers' fields, which were cemeteries that were specifically created to bury the poor. But they would also be taken out of dead houses, or they would be sold from workhouses or by hospital managers to resurrectionists, and they also came from prison wards.
So anyone that died in these places, their body could be stolen?
Yes, certainly. Generally, it would be sold, actually, by the prison wardens or the hospital managers or the masters of workhouses. Obviously, all of that activity was illegal. The passing of the Anatomy Act in 1832, or the Act for Regulating Schools of Anatomy, abolished the practices created by the Murder Act and allowed for the bodies of the uncollected from hospitals, workhouses, and prisons to be donated to the anatomists. However, we did still see quite a lot of illicit selling of bodies for dissection and research purposes.
Despite the Anatomy Act, there still weren't enough.
Yes, absolutely. So Ruth Richardson actually details this quite extensively in her book, Death, Dissection, and the Destitute. She talks about the ineffectiveness of the Anatomy Act at stopping the trade in cadavers.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to have to pick up a copy of that. Did the resurrectionists resort to any other means to acquire these bodies?
Yes, actually. William Burke and William Hare, who were residents of Edinburgh at the time, committed a series of 16 murders from 1827 to 1828, specifically to sell these bodies to an anatomy school that was under the direction of Professor Robert Knox, quite a renowned anatomy lecturer. As a result of that, William Burke was hanged in front of a cheering crowd of 25,000 people in January 1829. Afterwards, his body was donated to medical sciences and subsequently dissected. You can actually still see his skeleton in Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh. Burke and Hare weren't the only ones. We also see a case of what became known as burking, or killing someone specifically to sell to the anatomists, in London. A man called John Bishop confessed that he and his accomplice, Thomas Williams, had supplied 500 to 1,000 disinterred corpses, in addition to 3 murder victims, to the anatomy schools in London.
The public were aware of what was going on. How did the public respond to the fact that the corpses of their loved ones were being stolen and anatomized?
The link between dissection and the criminal justice system, where dissection was regarded as the ultimate insult to the corpse of a murderer, exacerbated negative feelings towards the entire field of anatomy. So stigma towards dissection was only heightened as a result of the illicit corpse trade, and there was widespread fear of being wrenched from your grave and subjected to the anatomist's slab. And we can see that in a number of satirical cartoons of the day. The well-publicized crimes of William Burke and William Hare resulted in a boiling point of the public's tolerance of grave robbing. Up to about 1827, 1828, murder of the poor for dissection had been rumored, but the confessions of William Burke provoked a fearful public reaction, and this became known as Burkophobia or Burking mania. And it was this kind of fear of being killed, specifically to be sold to the anatomists, that really sparked legislative action in England in order to try to stop this practice.
Because of this fear, did the public do anything to try and keep their loved ones from being stolen from the grave?
Yes, they did. You could buy a number of different anti-theft devices, including bars that could be placed over the top of your grave or impenetrable coffins. There's actually one on display in the museum at St. Bride's. They also did used to post guards outside of burial grounds, generally just wealthier burial grounds. The paupers' fields and individuals of limited means couldn't afford such devices, which possibly explains why, at least in the Diary of the Resurrectionist, they list numerous paupers' fields as hunting grounds for corpses.
I know I asked this earlier, but did the Anatomy Act solve the problem of the massive amount of corpse theft?
No, it didn't. A lot of the research that has been conducted by historians such as Ruth Richardson and Elizabeth Heron has shown just how ineffective the Anatomy Act was at stopping the illicit trade in bodies. Partly to blame for the ineffectiveness of the Anatomy Act was the poorly defined role of the English Anatomy Inspectorate. This position was created by the Anatomy Act specifically to make sure that this law was upheld. This position was the first in a series of Victorian inspectorates put in place to monitor newly created legislation, and it was a bit of a farce. The men appointed to these positions were not given the power to actually protect the interests of the poor, so this allowed others to evade the law, which enabled the continuation of acquiring bodies through illicit means. The great increase in the number of bodies required by the medical profession continued to result in difficulties surrounding cadaver acquisition. By 1885, in London, there were 15 medical schools, and in the rest of England, there were an additional 9 medical schools. Estimates suggest that a total of 60,000 bodies during the later half of the 19th century were dissected in the anatomical teaching schools in England. So obtaining these bodies in these kinds of quantities obviously suggests that the resurrectionist activity continued well throughout the 19th century.
Do you know of any other instances of body snatching for the purpose of anatomical study on this scale from anywhere else in the world?
Yes, actually, even in my home state of Wisconsin, we do have evidence that resurrectionist activity and certainly human dissection was taking place during the 1800s. I think it was 1880s or so.
I was thinking the medical schools in Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York, they also were renowned for their body snatching activity in the early 1800s to mid 1800s. And in Indianapolis, actually, when the downtown area was being redeveloped, most of the old public cemeteries were found to be almost completely empty because they'd been raided by the medical schools.
There is a whole volume talking about dissection in the U.S. during about 1850s to about 1910s. The Bioarchaeology of Dissection and Autopsy in the United States, edited by Kenneth Nystrom, that has a lot of different chapters on different locations where dissection was taking place in the U.S. during the long 19th century.
Thank you so much for talking to us. It's been amazing and fascinating. Definitely satisfied my curiosity on this topic. That was Dr. Jenna Dittmar, Research Associate for the University of Cambridge.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Both of these things make us more visible, which helps our creepy community grow. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, to give a donation. Or you can become a patron on Patreon. We have several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 per episode. Patrons at this tier and higher get access to our patron-only feed, which we often post on between episodes. All tiers are also eligible for our Fleet Street Meat Raffle, where we raffle off one Morbid-themed item a month to one lucky patron. Higher tiers include rewards like outtakes, ad-free episodes, and extra short stories read by me. If you'd like to reap these rewards, go to www.patreon.com/morbidcuriositypodcast. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.